Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. I hope you're all well. I will start to share my screen now and we can start. So my name is Sasha Kosanic. I'm researcher at Liverpool John Moores University, and I will presenting today climate and environmental change impacts on disabled population. So a bit about me. I'm interdisciplinary researcher in climate change, biodiversity, ecosystem services, nature contributions to people, and vulnerable population, disabled, indigenous, elderly, and children. Recently, I did my postdoc in Constance in Germany, and now I'm back in Liverpool in UK where I did my PhD. But what is really important here to stress that, of course, both cities have different climate, and these different climate impacts differently us, human population. So first, I want to lead you a bit about historical climate change, because we all know that climate change was happening throughout the Earth history. And there are still some deniers who don't think that climate change is real, but luckily we have actors such as Leonardo DiCaprio, many celebrities who constantly point out that we don't have a time, and they are trying to translate also the science more into the society. So we are also losing a number of species, but we are also having a big changes in ice sheets. For example, last year, Antarctica has one of the highest temperature record in history since we have the measurements. So where are we now? We are actually in the last interglacial Holocene, after the last glacial age, Pleistocene, but we can say we are also entering a new epoch, Anthropocene. Why? Because we put such a huge carbon footprint on this Earth. And this carbon footprint is not just in greenhouse gases, is also in a land use change visible, in plastic pollution. And this is something that we need to be really careful of, because climate change, it is one of the major environmental stressors, but it's not the only one. Now, I want to lead you to this climate, anthropogenic climate, and how, at the end, how this impacts different indigenous and different vulnerable populations, such as disabled population. So anthropogenic climate change is happening because we are putting too much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And this is in particular after industrial era, in post-industrial revolution, approximately 1850. So all this climate change today is a result of human activities and fossil fuel burning. What is really important that we understand, so we understand the current situation and the seriousness of the current situation, we need to understand that we have this greenhouse gas around the greenhouse gases around the Earth that are usually there in a very small amount, and they keep our Earth warm, that we can live. They keep our Earth livable. But if we have too much of these greenhouse gases like we have now, then we have a huge problem, because there is no reflection of sunlight back to the space. So we have long-lived greenhouse gases such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and water vapor, and they stay in the atmosphere for a very long time, like 30 years. And this is the problem. Even if we stop now, we have a problem in the next 30 years, but we need to stop, because if we don't stop polluting our earth, we will have a bigger problem. And we also have a short-lived greenhouse gases, such as sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and trophic ozone. Beside this, as I said, we have a land use change, deforestation, and that also impacts biodiversity reduction. We cover our land, our natural land, with more agricultural land. And this is releasing carbon dioxide from the soil. So we also have this positive albedo in a way that we can, if we're reducing the ice caps, then we have a lower level of reflection, the sunlight into the space. And this is for your information what happened in the last 100,000 years with the Earth. We never passed 300 parts per million of CO2, and now we have 420. So this is in last October, the measurement of carbon dioxide at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, and it was 420. What is important, especially for this, for us to understand in terms of regional context, it is that climate change, it's not going to be homogeneous everywhere. So it's not going to be equal. It's going to be very unequal. So it's going to be different in UK, it's going to be different in China, different in Korea, different in Japan, in Australia. And here we can see that we have, on the first figure, we can see that we have different types of temperature increase depending on greenhouse gases scenarios. And it can be very severe, up to 5 Celsius degrees to the end of this century, or it can be up to 1.5 or 2 that we are hoping. With precipitation and rain, it's even more trickier to understand the changes and what is happening at the local scale. It's very difficult because precipitation is very variable, but we also miss a lot of measurements. So it's not easy to detect what is happening with the presentation. And this is one of my research on basis of Germany, why it's important to understand the regional level of climate change. At the first figure above, you can see the climate that was changing at the beginning of this century. And down the lower figure, at the upper figure, you can see that not everything is green, red, and blue. This is the positive trend, the warming on the left side. And what is on the right side is the magnitude of this trend. And if you can see, there is also one blue dot. That means that in the beginning of this century, there was also cooling. But if you look at the second half of 20th century, there is no cooling. There is just red, just warming up. And this is really important to understand climate change at the local level, so we can understand how this impacts different disabled population, and then translate this knowledge to the policy making. So this is why I'm giving you this introduction into climate change, because we really need to understand what is happening at the local and regional scale to be able to make disabled population more resilient. But not only that, we also need to be able to translate what is happening to disabled communities, because they need to be prepared. They need to have enough knowledge to know what might happen, so they are prepared for example, extreme events. And now we are coming to extreme events. Besides global temperature increase, we also can have changes in precipitation rates, and then we can have floods, but we can also have heat waves, cold waves, hurricanes, and fires. Like we can see this flood in Germany this year, bushfires in Australia 2019, 2020, or big heat wave that hit Paris in 2003. They're really, really problematic for all of us human population, but in particular for vulnerable population. So some other climate change impacts can be extreme, also extreme level of sea level rise and ocean warming. And these are changes that are happening not like extreme events very abruptly, but they are happening in the longer time scale, but they will also impact the disabled population. And this is something this is something that is also happening with the glacier. It leads. Sorry. Sorry. I need to change something. I'm really sorry. I think I might. There went something wrong with the presentation. Okay, so we are here. So impacts also can be made on biodiversity and land. And this is important because our well-being depends on biodiversity. So we can have a declines, we can have extinction, and we can have changes in geographical distribution. And this is what is happening that is crucial to understand how climate impacts on biodiversity and then on ecosystem services and nature contributions to people. So basically, we will have the loss in species, and this impacts our well-being. I will tell you later on how. And here you can see that the most endangered species are cichlids, but also from invertebrates, they are corals, as we know. And from big vertebrates, we have mammals, and we have sharks and rays. And now we come to the main point of this talk. Sorry, I hope that this introduction was not boring, but I think it's very crucial. Why it matters. So why climate change matters for disabled population and all human population? So we have ecosystem services, and ecosystem services is everything that we get from nature. So we have supporting services, provisioning services, cultural services, and regulating services. For example, Regulating services is regulation of air, regulation of climate. Provisioning services is food, timber, clean water. Supporting service is, for example, pollination, formation of soils, so important for agriculture. Cultural service is something that is super crucially important for disabled population. Cultural service, it can be recreation, aesthetic value, spiritual values, local and indigenous knowledge. So this is all cultural services. And we have a new term that is called nature contributions to people, that is a bit broader than ecosystem services, that is not very rigid. So changes in these services because of climate change impacts our life. And nature contributions to people, we have material, non-material, and regulating. The much broader notion of nature's contribution to people emphasize the culture is to central to all of the links between people and nature and recognize other knowledge systems, for example, those of local communities and indigenous people much more before. So how can we make research that we understand ecosystem services and nature contributions to people framework to help us to understand our relationship between vulnerable populations such as indigenous, local, elderly, youth, and disabled? Cultural ecosystem services, we need to pay attention, as I said, on cultural ecosystem services or non-material nature contributions to people. And why is this important? So if you have someone who has visual impairment, who is blind, they won't see the same, this upper photograph. So in the French Alps, they will be in the French Alps, but they will concentrate not on a sight, they will concentrate on the smell and on the hearing. And this is something that current conservation strategies and current policies don't take into account at all. But we need to take into account disabled population, right? We need to have a conservation strategies for everyone. And as I said, this cultural ecosystem services of non-material nature contributions to people, such as aesthetic value, recreation, cultural heritage, knowledge systems, spiritual values, and inspiration, they are really, really important because they can differ between different disabilities, as I mentioned now. We can also have something that is ecological grief that is happening in indigenous population and populations that are very much connected to the land. And this can also happen in vulnerable populations such as disabled population. So what is ecological grief? It is basically a mental problem because of the changes of ecosystems and species. So everything that I mentioned before in the introduction of this talk about climate change and how it impacts us and how it impacts our biodiversity on a longer time scale, this can impact our well-being, mental well-being as well. So beside nature contributions to people, this is another aspect that we need to take care of and we need to pay attention to. So this was our research in climate change and nature contributions to people. And in Madagascar, where we look at also disabled population within indigenous population. And this is going to be even further problematic if we have this intersectionality. So we have indigenous population that are already very vulnerable, but we also have some disabled population within indigenous population. And here, how we did this research in Madagascar, we did with participatory workshops, semi-structured interviews, and here you can see the figure, the photograph from participatory workshop in one of the villages, and you can see there were very few people with disabilities. This is here, 2 and 1, that came to this workshop because they were afraid, they didn't know if they will be asked something. And you know, in this type of communities, disabled people are very much excluded, and we need to change this. And this is the job of the scientists, that we need to include disabled people into research, so we understand even further how climate change and changes into biodiversity impact disabled population. And this is the well-being categories that impact the populations in Madagascar. So peace of mind and spiritual experience was one of the major impacts of the changes in the environment, but also basic materials for good life, like food, water, etc. And of course, all that impact their well-being, even physical, or as I said, ecological grief as a mental health. And we can see here what categories are linked to mental, to physical well-being, mental and physical. Material are the most, 188 coding for linked to well-being. And I said material are food, water, etc. Then we have regulating, such as regulation of climate, regulation of air. And then we have also non-material, 224, which are, as I said, knowledge system, aesthetic values, etc. And then the other. So now why I gave you this introduction into our research in Madagascar, because this was the tipping point when we discovered that there is no much research on climate change and people with disabilities. And we published a letter in Science that was very well accepted. Climate Concerns and Disabled Community explained just this, that IPBES report that looks at biodiversity provisioning to people, and IPCC report, the biggest report on climate change, they don't mention disabled impacts on disabled population. And this is the huge problem. This article in Science was really well accepted, and there was a publication in Forbes on this article. Is it too late that the impact of climate change on people with disabilities is getting discussed only now? Yes, it is, and it's not. We need to discuss now because we don't have too much time. So this discussion needs to be going on. And this is just from our latest paper that is now in the review of the broader literature on climate and environmental change impacts on disabled population. So if you can see, there is almost no research throughout the world. So yellow points the research only on climate change. So this is here. Green only on nature contributions to people and ecosystem services, and blue both ecosystem services and nature contributions to people and climate change. But if you can see, all of this is missing. Then Latin America, it's also missing. Very little research done in Africa, very little. And the most research is done in Northern Hemisphere, in the States and Europe, but still very little. And we, in this paper, we try to discuss climate change impact from the perspective of environmental justice. So there are three perspectives of environmental justice: distributional dimension, who gets what. So how do climate and nature contributions to people changes impact disabled population. Then we have recognitional. Are people with disabilities recognized in the research and policy of climate change and NCPs? And to what extent are disabled population including in decision and policy making regarding climate change and NCPs? And this is the photograph that clearly depends how flood can be problematic for someone with disability. So what we discovered, and basically what is important to repeat one more time. So climate change impacts that are directly impacting disabled population on a huge level are extreme events. We have, as I said earlier, extreme and not extreme climatic events. But the ones that are impacting disabled population the most and taking lives are hurricanes, cyclones, floods, heat waves, and cold waves. Non-extreme events that are happening on the much larger time scale are sea level rise, biodiversity loss, and invasive species. So what happened in Hurricane Katrina in the States? It impacted 155,000 people with disabilities. This is really a lot. I'm not saying that all of them died, but they were all impacted in one way or another. So what we discovered that we have impact before disaster, according to urgent information and early warning system. So we don't have enough access to urgent information and early warning systems. Then we have during disaster, which is a problematic evacuation, transport, and shelters. We don't have enough and adequate evacuation, and we don't have accessible shelters. And this is the problem. You need accessible toilets, accessible beds, etc. And after disaster, we know that disabled population is usually lower economic wealth and lower economic on a lower economical scale in a society. And then we have a problem with housing, food, water, but also medical care and education for children. Because if you lost your medical documents in the house that is under the water, you just cannot access them, and you cannot reply to another school in another city. And that is a big problem. Excuse me. This is a big problem for the children. So how the nature contribution to people impacts disabled population? I know this slide is going to be a bit difficult for you to read, but I will just lead you through. And it was shown in Madagascar. It's the same story here. The most important nature contributions to people's services are material, such as material assistance like medications or food and water, energy, but also non-material, such as physical and psychological experience. As I said, aesthetic value, recreation, spiritual value, knowledge systems. But what is important with these knowledge systems is important that they are very much part of us, and they impact our culture, but also our personal individual identity. So, for example, you live in one village that you live all your life, and then flood comes and you need to move, and you are living in a big city and you're lost. And this is something that impacts everyone, but it can be much harder to adjust to these changes if you have a disability. Transition to these changes can be much, much harder. And how we can change this in the future, and how we can, beside translating science to policy, what we can also do. We can change this through sustainable development goals. I'm pretty sure you all heard about sustainable development goals, because there was a big report of the United Nations on sustainable development goals and disability in 2018. But sustainable development goals are global goals that is actually really hard to achieve on a local scale. And this is something that we need to understand. So we need to understand how we can implement these sustainable development goals at the local scale in order to reduce poverty, inequality, climate, environmental degradation, and to reassure that we will live in a peaceful and more just communities. So basically, the concept of sustainable development goals is leave no one behind. And this is what we came with our research on climate change impacts and environmental change impacts on disabled population and to sustainable development goals. So you can see in the center, climate action. This is really important. Life below water gives us food, but also is a huge carbon sink. And we have a life on land that gives us all this biodiversity that we enjoy. So how we can incorporate this in disabled population and SDGs? We have one-way benefits, but we have mutual benefits. So in mutual benefits, to achieve this, to kind of improve these three goals, 13, 14, 15, that are in the center, we need to have reduce poverty for disabled population. And how are we going to do this? With equal education. I'm a lecturer at the university. There is very few disabled students in geography departments, very few. And we need to change this, but we need to change this with the changes of the education. We need to make education more inclusive. And you as colleagues, allies, parents, relatives need to encourage disabled kids to go to the further education. Then we need to have a gender equality. If we have a big difference between girls and boys, it's very hard for girls with disabilities, even much harder than for boys with disabilities. So we need to encourage them also to gain the confidence, but we also need to make societal changes. We need to build this gender equality. And then to reduce inequalities, we need all of this together, right? So we need no poverty, we need quality education and equal education, and we also need gender equality. And why I'm saying this is the report, UN report on disability and sustainable development goals. And you can see persons with disabilities, which are orange dots, and person without disabilities. And this is different finishing university throughout different countries. What is important here, that you can see that for young people without disabilities, this percentage is 24. This is a huge difference. And for people with disabilities, this percentage is 12. And it's the Yeah, the differences are quite big. In some countries, they're not that big, but in some countries like Saudi Arabia, the difference is really, really huge. So what we can do, what are the main actions that we need to do to include people with disabilities in policy making? We need to get more research, get disability data, and identify the main stakeholders at the local and the global scale. We need to understand the different discrimination, hidden discrimination between indigenous disabled people, women who are disabled, other genders, people of different colors, and poor people. And we need to include existing research into IPBS and IPCC reports. Excuse me. Also, we need to connect with disability organization, advocates, and researchers. So this is important. We need to have a contact. We can't translate science to policy if we don't have a contact with disabled organization, advocates, and researchers. This is a crucial, crucial connection. And then we need to have equitable risk assessment, pre-climatic events, during climatic events, post-climatic events. And also we need to understand better on a local scale how the climate change will impact NCPs in non-material way, material, and regulating. And this is the network of my collaborators. Without them, my research would not be possible. Here I would really like to mention Jan Petzl, Miali Razianatovo, and Berta Martin Lopez, who contributed to this last study on climate change impacts on disabled population. Thank you very much for your attention. If we have any time, I'm open for any questions.
So there were two questions about your presentation. First, thank you for your presentation a lot. As yeah, we really didn't thought about the how can I say, the emotional and well-being of the disabled people when we are talking about the climate changes. Okay, so that was quite impressive in your presentation. And first, our question was, could you please tell us about more details about NCP, because NCP is not really a familiar concept still in Korea. So please tell us more about the NCP. And also the second question was, could you please tell us about good examples of include the voice of persons with disabilities into the decision-making tables? There were two questions.
Okay, thank you very much for this. Sorry, maybe it was a bit confusing at the presentation, but I will repeat one more time. So NCPs it's a novel formation of ecosystem services. So ecosystem services is everything that we gain from nature. As I said, like food, aesthetic values, spiritual values, and that all impacts our well-being. And this is also what NCPs are. But the main difference between ecosystem services and NCPs is they are not that rigid. They're more flexible. So I will give you an example. If you go in Arctic, in Inuit community, they all live their life in a way that they hunt in the ice. And this is their way of being. But this is also their food. So this is both, this is material service, but this is also non-material service. I hope I'm making this clear now. So in NCPs, these material and non-material services, they are more connected. And we need to understand them both to be able to translate this into the policies. I hope this is satisfying answer for NCPs. And the second question was, do I have any good examples? Well, this is something that is called recognitional justice, or I mean, recognitional and procedural justice. So how much the people with disabilities are actually including in policy making. And this is what we found very, very rare. It's almost, there are no substantial examples that we can say, oh, one nation did that and that works. So we are still at the beginning of understanding how climate change will impact different disabled populations. So, for example, climate change, flooding will be more severe for someone in electric chair than for someone with cerebral palsy or someone who is blind. We need to understand this, and we to have a mitigation strategies how to make those populations more resilient. Then, as I said, we need to communicate with disabled population, disabled organizations, and disabled activists to translate this knowledge into policy making. And then we can get to procedural justice. And then we can say, okay, now disabled population we can include into this policy making, and we know what we need to do in particular region. We need to understand that it's going to be different in different parts of the world, as I said, because climate change is very heterogeneous. I hope I answered this question as well. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer.